Okay, any other questions? So just remember, if your presentation on Tuesday, please upload your slides to that URL that I've specified so that everything is on my laptop and that way we can move quickly. Occasionally PowerPoint has problems on Mac, so if you're using PowerPoint, preferably also upload a PDF as a backup. If you're, yeah.
Is Google Slides cool?
It's cool, yeah, sure. I mean, again, might be simpler to. I think the problem with Google Slides, yeah, I mean, we can access it. So, yeah. So, but just as a backup, it might be good to download a PDF. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So last time around we had just a sec. So I'd kind of given you a general sense of what kind of the main security primitives are, and then towards the end, I'd started going through some of the challenges that are specific to embedded cyber physical type systems. And I guess the foremost really is that the attack nature of attacks is significantly more, partly because these are systems that interact with physical things, and partly because they are unattended, and partly because they're resource constrained. So all these three things sort of come together. So physical attacks, or so-called side channel attacks, which refers to that. So they're related but not identical. So side channel attacks refers to the fact that even if I'm worried about just the software security, there are ways in which you can break into a system, not by breaking the key directly, kind of purely in the software arena, but make use of some physical attributes of the system. So, for example, some of back in starting in 90s, so there used to be a standard called DES, which was for a long while the standard crypto thing that US government had mandated. And one of the ways it was broken was the following, that when DES ran, it had a loop, and in which that loop processed each bit of the key. And the amount of work the loop did depended upon what the bit was. And by monitoring the power trace of the devices, you could see what the key was. So even though key was secret nominally and you can protect everything, but the fact that it was drawing power, and power had something to do with the key, and in general, power consumption and RF emission and sound a system makes and the heat it emits, all of these things have some correlation with the nature of the computation that's taking place. You have a question?
Why would it draw different amounts of power just for different?
The amount of, so I should be more precise. The amount of time it was taking depended upon whether the bit was 0 or a 1. And so in the power trace, you could see kind of peaks of different height. Okay, so I should have been more precise. But that general concept, amount of power, depends upon, so for example, um, uh, so power results in transients in the supply and the currents in the circuit. And in circuit, you have loops so current loops result in electromagnetic waves being emitted, and that's the source of RF emission. So a lot of work in recent years has also shown that by just picking up that RF emissions, you can also infer what is going on, and probably the most advanced of that nature is this group out of Georgia Tech that I mentioned last time. So it's still a very limited thing, but what they're able to show is that they can if computation is periodic, they can identify what instruction was being executed. Some work here by one of Paulo Taboada and my former student. In small microcontrollers, we can even figure out what was the value of the operand. So like it's an add instruction and you were adding 3 plus 5. Okay, so we can kind of do that level of probing just by external means. Sound, I mentioned that group in Israel. So these are all things where I'm breaking into the crypto system via some physical signal that is being emitted. A related issue is that the physical side itself becomes a vector of attack. So just to give, for example, before the data gets digitized, then crypto really has no role to play. But I can still mess with the signal. So I can mess with the analog waveform before it hits the sensor, or from the sensor to the A to D converter. Anywhere along that pathway, I can inject noise or do other sort of stuff to kind of mess with these things. And then the obvious one on the actuator side, you can just put a plier into the gear, and that's a form of an attack. And again, in unattended systems, these kind of physical attacks take on importance as well. Computational demands of security processing, that's the other issue. Particularly things like public key crypto and all are extremely compute intensive, even for standard computers, let alone when you're doing it on a microcontroller class device. And then some of the techniques I had mentioned last time, things like homomorphic and all, they are really, when you're looking at kind of low end stuff, so are pretty intense. So what usually happens is sometimes there are hardware accelerators handling the crypto part. So for example, AES is used, the current crypto standard. So if you look at Zigbee radios, they usually have a hardware accelerator attached for it. But generally speaking, this tends to be an issue also. And the related one is just the battery, so they kind of go hand in hand. The increased attack surface, so this is a point that I made. So the physical part is an attack surface, as well as the fact that it is much harder to secure and manage when you have a large number of systems. A few computers, you can have system administrators carefully kind of arranging things and all. But once you have hundreds and thousands of sensors in a building, securing them, just the system administration part becomes problematic, and that results in loser practices. Even things like keeping things patched and up to date and all are very problematic. There's a Wall Street Journal article a few months ago which kind of showed that one of the biggest exploits that currently exist is the unsecured Wi-Fi routers, which we buy for our homes. And the problem is not so much, oh, you don't set the password, okay, which indeed is, but the deeper problem there has to do with the way the manufacturing chain works for these devices. So what typically happens is that there's some company which makes a system on chip. That company usually also creates the firmware. They ship the chip. Some white box, gray box manufacturer in some unknown place takes that chip, puts it into a board, creates a box. Either you may be buying that box directly, that unknown name box, or it might be going to whatever, Apple, Hewlett Packard, whatnot. They put their label on it, they sell it. Now, let's say a vulnerability is found. For example, some vulnerability in the network stack of Linux, which that firmware which was put. Customer is 4 hops away. You don't even know what chip it is. In fact, 2 boxes from the same vendor may be using different manufacturers' chips and all. And no one along this food chain has a motivation to do that patch. The user cannot, the OEM cannot, the company which is putting the label is really the chip vendor, and they may fix things and it might be sitting in some esoteric corner of their website, but no one else gets paid. So unpatched firmware is a huge problem, and there are hundreds of millions of these devices. I mentioned Shodan, the search engine for IoT devices, which is basically used this way. I mean, you identify what are all the things out there, and then you attack them with known vulnerabilities. And there are standard packages and all which sort of people use. So, so it's very easy to kind of go around attacking these things and all. There are alternative ways you can kind of structure things and all, which help mitigate the problem. So just to give you an example, what the philosophy I adopt, I kind of play around with these technologies quite a bit at my home, you know. I basically protect everything behind a firewall and then protect that like paranoid. Okay, I mean, everything ingoing, outgoing is protected so that I don't have to worry about. I have a few hundred devices at home. There is just no conceivable way I can keep them patched. So one good firewall is better, but most people who are deploying these things or just buying and all, I mean, they don't really have that level of sophistication to pull it on. So just increased attack surface. And then the final point that the when these devices do get attacked, the consequences are potentially far more dangerous because they are oftentimes controlling physical stuff, your security of home, medical condition, those kind of things. Okay, so so now let's look at the kind of attacks and all that we can kind of look at. So very broadly, you can think of attacks which are passive and attacks which are active attacks. Okay. So by passive attacks, I mean the attacker basically is just passively going to listen and monitor and extract information. Usually, this is for purposes of some sort of privacy-related stuff, but that privacy-related information leakage can in turn translate into physical danger. Okay, so for example, most homes here in Los Angeles have electric meters, which are not smart meters, they're just ordinary meters, but they transmit their current power consumption over an RF link. And the reason they do that is so that some years ago, LADWP decided that instead of the person coming into your home and then finding the home locked and stuff like that, they'll just drive by. So it's a very short range, 50-meter type radio, and they just drive by and read the meters. Okay, but the protocol is totally unsecured, unencrypted. You can just sort of use your laptop, the radio receiver you can buy from many places, and look at the protocol, and it's very trivial to figure out what's going on. And of course, it's published at various places at the state. With this, sitting outside, you can make a lot of inferences about what's happening inside the home, in particular whether there is someone at home or not. Okay, and then of course that leads to physical security issue, namely being able to burglarize and all. So if you're casing a neighborhood, instead of trying to burglarize a home which someone isn't there, you can easily kind of go after homes where no one is there. And so these kind of security, privacy leads to physical security kind of issues, obviously. Active attacks are the ones where instead of just passively monitoring traffic or signals and all, you actively seek to attack the system by injecting malicious software or noise or some sort of other things of that nature. These could be both attacks on the firmware or hardware of the node itself, or it could be attacks on the communications that the node is engaged in. And when it comes to communications that you're seeking to attack, very broadly, they fall into categories where you are affecting the integrity of the data. So you're kind of messing with things. Again, most low-end devices don't adopt what is in theory possible, so which means integrity checks and these kind of things are not necessarily there. But the other thing is there are also attacks that you can mount which do not require you to do any crypto breaking at all. So for example, we saw time synchronization quite a bit, okay? And the way time sync worked was that we were sending a packet, time stamping it, receiving the packet, time stamping it, and doing some bunch of message exchanges around that. Imagine an attacker, what it does is it just inserts a delay in the packet. Okay, so what I mean by that is there are two nodes that's attempting to time synchronize, and all the attacker does is it prevents the packet from being received and then hangs on to it. It doesn't need to know what the contents are, and then just transmits it a little bit later. And then suddenly we are messed with the time synchronization. And that in turn can lead to consequences like if it's a sensor trying to localize where the event was happening and things like that, we are affecting the localization. This concept has been applied to GPS. Lots of work and all where people have now shown that they can essentially create a localized bubble where anything using GPS can be fooled about its location, considerably. But all sort of other stuff, like the ability to affect timing in turn can be used for a variety of purposes. In a smart grid, it can result in the utility not knowing where the fault happened. Okay, instead of thinking that the fault was in transmission line A, it might be in some hundreds of miles away. So you can kind of manipulate things. So attacks can, on the communication layer, they can come at the physical layer, it can come at the IP layer, and they can come at the transport layer, and all of them are susceptible. Just recently, there have been a series of papers showing that NTP itself is highly vulnerable. And that is something that obviously we rely on, and timestamp in turn leads to integrity of databases, file systems, all sort of things. So many of our workhorse things are workhorse services are vulnerable to these kind of side attacks happening. So you don't have to compromise directly, but sort of come through these services that we are working with. At the physical layer, very common issue is, and that works in simpler systems, which often don't pay attention, are simply message replay. And a great example of this is all these umpteen garage door openers which you can buy, which are universal garage door openers, because all they do is they replay the signal out. And the reason is that the messaging protocol has no notion of time kind of built into that. So message replaying in low-end systems is a very sort of common attack. Network layer or routing attacks. So the idea out here is that I can mess with the system by advertising false routes. So to give you an example, a lot of current systems in buildings which rely on either ZigBee or Z-Wave kind of systems, they rely on ad hoc routing. That is multiple wireless nodes, and there's a routing table that gets established, and then eventually the traffic is supposed to go to some sort of a controller. In a poorly designed system, you can imagine that I can mess with this routing table and then attract the traffic away, and thereby again affect the system. So sinkhole attack is where adversary basically compromises one node and then just grabs all the traffic there, and then essentially does a denial of service attack on the overall system. So the other one of the same nature is something called wormhole attack, where kind of the idea is that where a route did not exist, I end up creating a route and thereby give the impression to a node which is incorrect with respect to the network topology, and whatever consequences follow from that. And a third one is a so-called Sybil attack. And the idea out here is that since these devices are unattended, what if I clone them? So it's not hard to read memory contents, flash contents and all. So I literally just get into the business of cloning these things. And I place additional nodes in the system. And now the question becomes that how does the system know that this is a valid node versus an invalid node? And the issue basically boils down to is that does this node have some sort of a unique secret which cannot be extracted away? One way you can imagine, and it's kind of a non-flyer, is that in a large-scale system, which is pairing. Okay, so my phone talks to a Bluetooth device only if it is paired, and that means that there was some period of time when I had the device in front of me, and then there are usually things like press the number you see in the other screen, and also we kind of do a pairing, and then the idea is that pairing establishes a shared secret, and as long as the sensor side, the device side, is able to protect that secret, we are safe. That is, it should not be able to replicate that. Leaving aside the issue that things can be replicated, the other issue is that this pairing approach works fine if you have a few devices, but if you have hundreds and thousands in a building, I mean, it becomes, because you have to kind of bring things into physical proximity and all. So another approach which has emerged in recent years is a concept whereby each device is manufactured with a unique signature. So this is something called physically unclonable function, PUFs. So there are many ways of realizing it. The concept of PUFs, one way you can say is, on my device there is a little ROM, and that ROM is a unique random content is put into it when we manufacture it, and we design it to be non-tamperable. But that is painful from a manufacturing perspective. So what people have been doing in recent years is kind of a cool concept, which is the following. Every chip which is made is slightly different. That is, delays are slightly different, the characteristics of the chips are slightly different. And then they create special circuits which amplify that difference and then generate essentially a unique signature, which is also stable across temperature and stuff like that. So essentially, kind of the concept becomes that every chip is coming, is inherently just the way semiconductor manufacturing works, comes with a unique signature. And then somehow we kind of have a database of that. So kind of as these things are going out, so you're not manufacturing it deliberately. That's how they're sort of coming out. And then now you have a unique identity which you protect and all. Finally, there is a concept called Trusted Platform Module, TPM. These are tiny little chips which are designed to be tamper-proof, which have such a unique thing. They also have a secure area of memory, a whole bunch of other stuff. And these kind of concepts are being used in many other ways also. So you can buy TPM and go on Amazon, type TPM modules, and you'll see little boards with some headers. They're meant to plug into your PCs and all. But in smartphones and all, like Apple builds this secure enclave onto their chip, which is their version of TPM, and likewise, sort of a lot of other people are doing. So that's kind of a third approach which is happening, all in part to basically make sure that no one can, among other things, also to combat the Sybil attack. There are a lot of other things, other purposes that the same features kind of hold true. So Sybil attacks is another aspect. Unattended node operations lead to further risks in this thing, and kind of essentially I can, even trivial stuff like I can move the node. Okay, I mean in many cases even that if it's a sensing device of some form and I change its location, becomes an issue. So people go through all sorts of things like once the node is installed, you will have some sort of a tamper detection system out there, whether the node was moved, usually using inertial sensors or things like that, or even things like has my radio environment changed, has my sound signature changed. You basically try to see that is there a material change in the physical surroundings that might indicate that something has happened. So unattended node operations turns out to be kind of another challenge. So I'm going to switch to a different slide set from a talk. Right. So let's look at some of the ways these devices and sort of sensors and actuators become vulnerable from the physical side, which was one of the modalities that I talked about. So if you look at a complete system in a very generic manner, then essentially I have the physical world, or humans, or plants of various physical plants of different forms, sensors. Usually sensors send their data across to some sort of decision-making computers, and then the results come back and they drive the actuator. So almost any system we can kind of view in that sense. And now if you think in terms of where all one could mount an attack, so I can certainly mount attacks on the communication channels. And in case of wireless, one attack is basically, namely jamming, is essentially pretty much very hard to combat. I mean, I can just mount a denial of service thing. The only saving grace is that if I fail to communicate with my sensors, then usually I can detect it and I know something bad is going on and then take some sort of corrective action. Delaying I refer to, so what if I were to simply delay the packets, and that can mess with the time synchronization services and all. And then modifying content, which would require breaking the crypto, but to help the bad guy, many of these devices either have very weak crypto or have no crypto. And even in cases where they have strong crypto, there are oftentimes bugs ready to be exploited. Okay, so, and even very, very subtle bugs. So for example, public key crypto depends upon that public-private key, and usually these are selected to be two large prime numbers. But it turned out one of the discoveries a year or two ago was that the prime number, the way these things were selected in the most popular library, was not entirely non-predictable. Okay, and therefore you can make a reasonable guess which pool of numbers they were coming from, and then significantly reduce the time it would take to attack it. So what this paper was showed was they were able to do it, but a state actor, namely NSA or the equivalent intelligence agencies with a lot more computer sources, can do it much more rapidly. So, so these are kind of things. Then the Next one is attack on devices. So I mentioned dislocation. I mentioned so you can alter the circuit or alter the firmware operation in some manner. Um, the altering the firmware operation in part is currently addressed by making every aspect of the software digitally signed. So the way, let's say, or I guess the best example would be iPhone because it's the most locked down device. Everything is signed. So you cannot run an arbitrary OS on it. And once you have the OS, you cannot run an arbitrary app on it. And it is not simply Apple saying so, it is because at every layer, for the next thing to run, it has to carry the right digital signatures. And therefore, so cryptographically, Apple kind of gets to control everything in that regard. Other devices have this thing to sort of different degrees. And finally, spoofing the physical signals, which is there's a sensor which is going to be capturing some signature. There is nothing preventing an adversary to mess with the signal before it reaches the sensor. Okay, so it doesn't need to break any crypto system and whatnot at all. Alter the circuit. What are the ways you can? Can you think of ways in which I can alter the circuit operation? So I gave one, which is noise on the trace, which is going between the sensor and the A to D converter, and thereby I can certainly affect things. What are the other ways you can think I can affect the hardware operation itself, and therefore, obviously, subsequently, software operation?
Could you wrap like a wire around it, put a strong current through it so you get like EM interference?
Okay, so I can cause EM interference. There are other ways I can interfere things. In theory, some of the newer memories are based on magnetic stuff, so I can have a magnetic pulse and I can affect things. Now, the problem with these is that these are usually very gross attacks in the sense that you'll just cause the system to stop or malfunction. How about something more surgical? So at the hardware level, it is possible with appropriate instrumentation and all to modify content of a bit in the flash on chip. You can also obviously go around and mess with the interconnect on the chip. Some of the ideas which were floated around in the recent FBI Apple snafu were going at that level. So you could certainly kind of do those kind of things potentially. So another very interesting attack I read just again within the past year or so was that memory locations in DRAM influence each other. So if I have locations which are physically proximate on the chip have couplings. And what this group, I think it was out of CMU, what they showed was that by selectively writing the right thing in memory that belongs to my process, I can influence the content of a variable in your process. Okay, if things were kind of rightly aligned and all. So there are all sort of these hardware level interactions and all which potentially are exploitable and can sort of cause a fair bit of damage. Some other stuff which falls into sort of unintended kind of things at the hardware and software level. So one thing in last year's CCS, which is kind of the main security conference, a group out of Purdue showed the following, that on your phones, they were working with Android devices. On your phones, when you turn the camera on, then essentially you get this live view, right? And the way this live view works is that it's grabbing frames and it's storing in some data structure. Now, what these systems don't do is go around scrubbing things. Okay, so this when a frame is no longer needed, it's released back to the dynamic memory pool, but the content is still sitting there. And that content over time, the data can get corrupted and all as other applications make use of that area of memory and all, but there is still sufficient stuff which remains. So what these guys showed was they can go around scavenging things. So these are photos you never took, but these were images of scenes that your camera was on for some duration. Okay, so these are not photos that you took, but they were just there. And a related one they showed was the following, which was even scarier. So there are several of these apps which are now floating around, which promise you um, secure messaging. Okay, so some of them are being used by ISIS and all, but they have very valid reasons as well. So the way these things work is there is end-to-end crypto. But of course, a human has to read it. So at some point in time, on the screen does appear the content of the image. And again, back to the same data structure story that these content of the screens are part of that memory, and if they are not scrubbed properly, which they often are not, then again you can kind of recover these things through this kind of a forensic analysis of the dynamic memory. So there are a lot of footprints and all of data which kind of is left behind to extract potentially also. So let's yeah, these are just some examples of kind of things people have done, or stupid things that manufacturers do. And also, for example, on roads, we have these sensors which detect when a car comes to the traffic light or how many cars are passing by. They used to be simple magnetic loops, and that would connect back to the controller, which is at some box at the intersection and controls the lights. But some years ago, things started becoming smarter, and a startup out of Berkeley started creating wireless magnetic sensors, which are buried into the road, and now essentially your whole system is kind of some sort of a wireless network and all. The only problem with their system, and there are many millions of these installed all over the planet, the only problem with that was that they forgot to appropriately secure the wireless protocol to their wireless nodes. And I guess they designed it in the more innocent days, but of course now people sort of went around and discovered it. So this article is about how using essentially a $500 software radio device, you can essentially hack into all these things. Okay, so another example. Students hack Waze, send an army of traffic bots. So Waze, I'm sure all of you know how it works. People sort of cars report things back, and that gives Waze a sense of what the traffic flow is. The attack, which was a master's thesis at Technion in Israel, what they did was they basically ran a whole bunch of Android emulators on some servers and had them pretend to be Waze participants, and essentially created fake traffic jams and all, in the sense that Waze thought there was traffic jam and there wasn't, or vice versa. Okay, so those kind of things. Of course, it got patched subsequently. Let's see, I already mentioned the EMI injection attack. Hollywood has discovered a whole bunch of these kind of things, and then I already mentioned the GPS type attacks and all. So what I'm going to describe next is a piece of work which happened again in Professor Tawada's group in my lab, to show kind of things can be done and how one can potentially make sensors more secure. So what we set out to do was to attack cars. And in particular, what we did was we attacked anti-lock braking systems in cars. So anti-lock braking systems are, you press the brake, and if the wheel is spinning too much, then depending upon that, the braking action kind of is different. So the way it does it, there's crucial part of the system is the wheel speed sensor, basically. So relative to what the car thinks we should be going, what the wheel is spinning at. So if there is little traction, the wheel will spin, it will know that. In particular, if I can mess with what the car thinks the wheel speed is, you can create all sort of chaos. So the way these wheel sensors work are that on the axle of the wheel, there is this kind of a notched thing, okay? And then there is a sensor, which is essentially a magnetic field sensor, so it's a magnetometer, okay? And then that, and this is on the car side of the thing, the car's body side of the thing, and that signal goes on to and goes to the computer with the car. So the way this works is if there's a magnetic, there's a magnet out here, and as this wheel rotates, it perturbs the magnetic field, in a sinusoidal fashion, and frequency of the sinusoid tells you the wheel speed. Okay, so that's kind of the basic concept. So magnetic field is going to be some varying amplitude, and there will be a frequency component. So what we set out to do was the following, that could, and the space out here is like a few millimeters, okay, so let's say half a centimeter. So what we set out to do was to cancel this magnetic field, the original magnetic field, and inject our own magnetic field. A little bit like these Bose or headphones work, which cancel out the aircraft noise and then let you listen to the music. Okay, so they do active cancellation. They sense and then generate opposite signal to cancel it. And in that case, just the music passes through. In this particular case, we cancel it and then we inject our own desired speed. Okay, so a little board we made along with sort of this whole control system behind it. But the main point is we could basically mess with the wheel arbitrarily in this particular case. And then, of course, the ramifications of that. So this is actually a cool video that a student prepared, which in first case, it's basically just a braking system working correctly. The simulator uses commercial type algorithms and all at the back end. Okay, in this case, we are just messing with one of the sensors, and of course, when the driver presses, they totally lose this kind of control. Okay, this concept that I can mess with cars in dangerous ways obviously is not new. This particular attack was new, obviously, but there are all sort of other attacks which have emerged in recent literature in the past small number of years, including things like many cars have tire pressure sensors, which are again used for beneficial purposes, namely to warn you that there's something wrong with the car. So there are two ways it is done. In some cases, there is literally a wireless sensor in the tire, and the other one, which some other cars uses, they look at subtle differences in the wheel rotation speed to infer that there is a change in diameter and therefore there is a change in pressure. The former category, there are these little sensors which are transmitting radio waves, except again, they are designed, no one thought there would be any security implications, so they are designed by sending out in the open an ID. So the packet goes out and it has a unique identifier. So let me put you in the bad guy's shoes. So let's say you knew that cars have these kind of tire pressure sensors, which they do, which among other things includes a unique ID. What are the things you think you can do with it?
Track that unique ID, see where the car is going.
Okay, so I can track and see where the car is going. Okay, that's still benign. Think more malicious.
Deflate the tire is in that false state of the tire is fine.
Okay, and that can cause these kind of issues. Sure. Okay. So coolest one which I thought of was the following. I can design a roadside bomb which kills exactly the car I intended to and is not triggered by anything else. Okay, so you can do, so anyway, point I'm trying to make is even benign things. Okay, and then another vulnerability which was highlighted 6 months ago or so was that entertainment unit in some cars, I think these were Nissans if I'm not wrong, but I forgot precisely which one, had a bug. And these entertainment units are also designed to receive the so-called digital broadcast data, digital radio stations where you also get these names of songs and advertisers and stuff like that. Okay, so there's digital data coming in which is processed by this. So what these guys did, they found that there was a buffer overflow bug in the software. They sent a broadcast, and that's easy to send. When you tune into the radio station, you basically get this malicious data, which then hacks into your entertainment system and then thinks are network, and from that point on takes over a whole bunch of other stuff, because these entertainment systems usually feed into the same display, which other more crucial information gets displayed at, and then you can start messing. creative ways. Okay, so lots of ways we can attack things. So what can we do about it? So one type of stuff you can do about it is to secure the sensors somehow. So what might that mean? Okay, so remember what's happening in these cases is the bad guy is messing with the sensor, the signal before it's hitting the sensor. Okay, so you have to somehow gain advantage over that, right? So just passively sensing, if you were simply a passive sensor just looking for the signal, there is nothing you can really do other than cross-check that the signal makes sense relative to what else I knew. Okay, so for example, if the car told me right now it was at location X and the next moment it tells me it's at location Y and it's physically impossible for the car to travel at that speed or acceleration, then I can kind of rule some of those things out. So I can have a model and I can cross-check against that. But what about hardening the sensor itself? So one idea which this student had explored was the following. So physical challenge response authentication. And kind of the idea is that we can arrange for gaining we can introduce something that an attacker cannot potentially know. And we do it in context of what are called as active sensors. So the attack we mounted previously was successful because that magnetic field was essentially fixed in the sense that its behavior was fixed, and therefore the adversary was able to address that. What if we were to somehow introduce some element which the adversary cannot know? So there are certain things to help you out. There are some physical properties that adversary can never violate, howsoever much may try. Speed of light, some certain mathematical equalities, certain inherent delays that exist in the system. So there are bounds to what adversary can do. So in particular, the delays are fundamental to any sensing and actuation circuits. So we could potentially exploit this. So the way it works, the idea works as the following. So think of this way, that instead of now relying on a fixed magnetic field, the sensor is going to also generate a magnetic field. And that magnetic field is going to interact with that rotating wheel, and then it's going to be modulated and I'm sensing it back. So I know what magnetic field I'm putting out there, and therefore, and relative to that, I'm going to be measuring the field. And the adversary, if this magnetic field was fixed, as it is traditionally in the cars, then adversary can do the kind of attack we were talking about. But what if we could indeed control this? So kind of the idea is then, therefore, that I have an active sensor where I'm going to actively make this magnetic field a function of time, and then the rotating wheel interacts with it, and I'm going to be kind of sensing that. And then the game I'm going to play is that at random time, which adversary cannot predict, I'm going to make the magnetic field 0. And of course, I know when I made the magnetic field 0, therefore I'm going to expect a response at that time which is also 0, barring certain delays. And if my sensing is agile enough relative to what adversary has to, the fundamental delays adversary has to face, then adversary cannot play the game of like, watch out for the field going to 0 and react accordingly, because there will still be a tiny amount of time delay. It just cannot react fast enough, basically. That's kind of the idea. So we make use of that fact. So essentially what it becomes is that whenever such a thing happens, even if adversary were to play, say, I'm going to watch out for this and then react accordingly, there will be a tiny amount of time in which it will fail to, and we detect that, okay, using kind of a detector. This concept, while I'm describing in terms like these, you can imagine any active sensor. So for example, let's say, how can a camera know that how can we know that we are indeed getting an image which was taken with the camera? Well, we could embed some sort of signature in the flash light that goes out, or a radar can embed certain kind of code in the signal that goes out. So any active sensor which shines energy into the physical world has the opportunity that it can embed some sort of a secret, and then the return signal is expected to have that, and we can detect an adversary through that manner. Now, in this case, obviously, I'm only detecting. Okay, once I detect, then the control system can be designed to ignore that Wheels reading. Okay, so kind of move it to some sort of a fail-safe mode. Uh, so using these kind of concepts in recent years, there are other things that emerged. So there's a whole area called secure localization, where kind of the concept is, I claim to be 10 meters away from you. Can I prove that I am no more than 10 meters away from you? Okay, so the idea being, any remote hack on an ATM, for example, you can detect that the person who says where it is. So, like my car key, the car should be able to verify that I'm close to the car and not someone is relaying my signal away near the car. So these kind of these kind of solutions have now sort of begun to emerge. Okay, I'm going to skip these. Other things one can do with the same kind of concept. Okay, so I've covered this. Yeah, attacks on RFID. Yeah. Uh, Attacks on RFID fall into this category as well. So a very common attack nowadays is that our passports and things like that have RFIDs, and someone sitting nearby can passively it can interrogate. Okay, and there has been some work out there now that can we detect these kind of things. Of course, the other option is to put your passport in a tin foil so that nothing emits. But so it turns out that any adversary who's trying to snoop will have an antenna, and that antenna in turn causes a perturbation, and you seek to detect that perturbation. So this broad area where sort of at the very least try to detect in a robust manner anyone who is snooping or messing with your sensor signal prior to the sensor signal coming to the sensor, that is while it is still in the analog domain. At some level, it is in some cases it's an impossible task, but a lot can be done nevertheless. Okay, so particularly if you have an active sensor, as opposed to one which simply relies on energy coming from the outside, active sensors being one which can send out a signal of their own. Some other examples of this nature. So location is one which is a favorite thing to attack, variety of reasons. So making a device appear at a different location where it is. So some of the work in that space, instead of relying on physical properties like this, has relied on things like mathematical properties. Okay, so to give you an example, let's say I want to lie. I have a mobile phone. I want to lie about my location. So the way I'm going to lie is cellular system tries to track me. So what the cellular system does is it sends out a signal at a particular signal strength, and it asks me to say what signal strength I received it at. And if I lie about it, then I'm lying about the range to that signal. And then I can therefore pretend my location to be somewhere else than it really was. But one thing which helps the infrastructure is triangular inequality. So it turns out it is relatively easy to make things such that I can lie in one direction but not the other. That is, I can pretend to be farther away than I am, but not closer than what I really am. And which is normally a desirable thing to be able to verify. But if that's all I can do, if all I can pretend is I'm farther away from a base station, then if I'm doing a triangulation, and if as long as I'm in the convex hull in between, then I cannot consistently lie to every base station. I'll have to pretend to be closer to one base station, because if I simultaneously tell everyone I'm farther away from you, then it enters into a geometric impossibility. So main point I guess I'm trying to make is that adversary can mess with these things, but there are certain things which can help you. Speed of light, delays, mathematical properties, and you can kind of use them to limit what the adversary, the bad guy, can kind of do or not do. The second category of measures are system level measures. Okay, so let the sensors be compromised. Let's try to see if something weird is happening. And here, Professor Tabuada and Suhas Digavi, their groups have done some interesting theoretical work in this direction over the past few years. And essentially, what it boils down to is the following. So, we are sensing stuff, we then feed it into a controller, and then the controller controls the actuator. So firstly, there is, one can show that designing a controller can be broken down into two separate steps. A decoder which reconstructs the state of the system. So I'm reading the sensors, and then I reconstruct the state of the system, and then I use a linear time invariant controller. So it turns out that any controller, a non-linear time varying dynamic controller, I can kind of think of it in terms of these two steps. And then in essence, the goal of the attacker is to mess with this. It wants to mess with what the system thinks the state of the physical world is. So in a sense, I want you to think I'm at a different location, or I'm at a different wheel speed, or any number of such things. So that's really the modality of the attack. What they showed, and this kind of doesn't directly translate into a practical thing, but it gives you some insight. So firstly, if an attacker can compromise more than half your sensors, then an attacker can always have a winning strategy. That is, it can always cause a wrong estimate of the state. But in the other direction, depending upon the system, I could construct a correct state even if sensors are compromised. And intuitively, you can say some very sophisticated version of redundancies kind of creep in. But the important result is that almost all systems can be recovered this way. That is, almost all complicated enough systems, there's enough coupling among the sensors that we can reconstruct the state very reliably. So essentially, our goal then becomes to limit how many sensors the adversary can compromise, and that we can do by hardening the sensors or physically securing the sensors. If an attacker can compromise an actuator, then things are a lot more problematic, because even a single instance of an actuator being compromised can cause a fair bit of damage before you discover it and then subsequently take it offline. So attacker can always win if it is able to attack the actuator. So actuator do need to be hardened and have redundancy and stuff like that and all. So particularly nowadays with whole sort of things like drones and all sort of coming into play, some of these topics have gained a lot of importance, because we are already seeing things like drones flying into flying paths, going over zones where they normally shouldn't, and also there are all sort of issues happening. There are certain companies which are trying to combat it also. There's a company whose business is that drones which are misbehaving, so they have these other drones which go and capture them physically, okay? Or in some cases, they, since these drones are being designed with pretty pathetic radios, again, non-encrypted or very weak encryption, and also they basically take over the radio link and they commandeer the misbehaving drones. So you'll see these kind of measures being deployed around airports and all, because it has emerged as a significant sort of concern. What else gets done? Another thing is that you also can bring to bear models. So what I mean by that is, imagine you're trying to protect a traffic network. So you know that the traffic flow is going to obey certain laws of conservation. That is, for example, if there is a road segment with no exits, then the number of cars which entered has to be equal to the number of cars that exited. So you can bring to bear this kind of knowledge. Likewise, the building, room level occupancy, door openings, and all, they all kind of give you multiple sensor data, but these data are not independent. They have to obey certain conservation properties. So you might imagine in a security situation, like fire happens in a building and fire alarm, and then we want to know where are all the people who have exited and all. So being able to track occupancy and exit and entries becomes important. while still having kind of sensors which are sensing infrastructure which is relatively modest. So making use of maps of buildings and conservation flows across them becomes an issue. So becomes an approach. So I guess what generally is happening in this space, and I guess this area firstly is a very active area of research across many places. But the main thing is the following takeaway: we know, at least at a theoretical level, how to protect data as it is moved, as it is stored, and as it is processed. Not that it's a solved problem, but in the sense that either we have efficiency issues or that software implementation have bugs, and both of these things do hurt. But nevertheless, in principle, we know how to do these things. But unfortunately, that alone is not sufficient, and I think the mindset is moving towards, firstly, things which are happening from the physical side. They're a lot harder to track. The other thing is, instead of just protecting the data, perhaps we should try to make sure that our outcomes are safe. So what I'm trying to say is that it's fine if a sensor is compromised. If my car is safe, that's what matters. So it's not protecting an individual sensor, but it's really protecting the overall system one should go after. And then finally, exploiting redundancy in whatever shape and form exists. Because protecting a cyber-physical system is never going to be just about crypto. Crypto is just part of the story. Oftentimes we kind of conflate the two. You can have the world's best crypto and still have an entirely insecure system because there are all these other stuff which are going on. So just generally this area, particularly because attacks have now begun to emerge, and their consequences are much worse than someone stealing your social security number, because the consequences are a lot more immediate. So there's a lot of emphasis on going after these kind of things currently. Power plant, traffic lights, aircrafts, airport operations, all these kind of things are quite vulnerable for a variety of reasons, and a lot of interest in kind of protecting these things currently, these kind of critical infrastructures. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. So we'll start doing the presentations on Tuesday. Again, upload the slides, please, so that we don't waste time here. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so see you on Tuesday.